This is another map that I made showing the Tennessee River at the Little Muscle Shoals as it would have appeared at this time. Hood's forces appear on about October 30th, really late at night on the 29th, but by the 30th, it's clear that Hood's force has appeared at Little Muscle Shoals. Hood partially crosses the Tennessee River. He sends over Stephen D. Lee's corps at first to the north side of the river. Those men lay a pontoon bridge, probably across the foot of Jackson Island in a place near Raccoon Ford, and they encountered the federal cavalry under John T. Croxton. Croxton, basically since the end of Wheeler's raid, has been patrolling the Tennessee River from Decatur to Eastport, 50 miles, trying to get any reconnaissance, any first word like a canary in a coal mine about any potential Confederate movements north of the Tennessee River. And on October 30th, that finally takes place. And he is numerically overwhelmed. He cannot possibly hold off Stephen D. Lee's entire corps. So Croxton retreats back to the east side of Shoal Creek, which puts a natural geographical barrier between himself and the Confederate Army, which is now massing at Florence and Tuscumbia. Hood's other corps do stay at Tuscumbia for the next 3 weeks, but Stephen D. Lee's corps pushes across to the city of Florence. And whenever the Confederates arrived in Florence then, around Halloween 1864, one witness to their presence in town is the diarist, Sally Foster, who by this time is a girl of 16, living in the Courtview Mansion, Rogers Hall, at the end of Court Street. You can't miss it. But she said in her diary for November 6th, "The rebels have been in town ever since last Sunday evening. The citizens all heard cannonading and did not know what to make of it. But we soon found out what it was. The rebels were crossing the river. They drove the everlasting old Yanks from Florence, and they, the Yanks, were so frightened that they retreated without firing again. The poor old dirty Rebs came up the hills from the river and met with a very, very warm reception from the ladies who were running to and fro up and down the street like they were half crazy. But they were only frantic with joy. The band of the rebels played very sweetly nearly all night. They were the first Confederate infantry we have had here since the war commenced, so you can imagine how much we appreciated them. They remained with us over 3 weeks." Here she seems to be inserting kind of a observation after the fact. This is obviously after November 6th. "They remained with us over 3 weeks, and there were balls, parties, concerts, or theaters at the male college nearly every night. I got acquainted with a number of generals, amongst them General Beauregard, Forrest, Lee, besides several others. Well, I cannot count other officers and privates." This scene is really reminiscent of some of those more joyful days back in 1861, whenever the rebellion was still in its infancy, and days like Shiloh and Chickamauga and Antietam were just a figment of anyone's wildest imagination. Sally Foster's observation about the women running to and fro up the street like they were crazy. Eliza Weekly, in her diary, also mentions that detail. So it was apparently something that people were like, "Oh, we're running around half crazy," but it's not. Now, her observation as well about balls and parties and concerts and cotillions, and there's this really, with the genteel officer corps, this celebratory attitude. This is one of those moments, and again, like I say, sometimes reading through this history, you think, if I was a Hollywood screenwriter, and I wanted to portray something so tragically ironic at this moment in time, how might I do that? Parties, celebrations, fitting. What it's about to be the bleakest chapter in the entire American West. Many of these men are going to lose their lives over the course of the next month. And they're going to retreat back through the city of Florence in utter disgrace and disheveled before the end of the week. What a bitter and tragically ironic tribute to what then is coming. Now, as I say, Croxton retreats across to the east side of Shoal Creek, putting that as a natural barrier between himself and Stephen D. Lee's corps at Florence. These are two maps that I've created, sort of showing the topography of the area and the main roads that existed back towards the federal stronghold at Pulaski. When it became clear that Hood was really crossing the Tennessee River at the Shoals, orders were given to have federal forces, available federal forces, concentrate at Pulaski. The reason for this is that Pulaski was at really the head of where the railroad went from Nashville, which is their main state base. And from Pulaski, they could respond really in any direction as exigencies and developing circumstances may require. Because no one really understood at this point, not even General Hood understood at this point, where exactly he was going to go next. Whether he was really going to invade Tennessee with his full army, whether he might turn his attention towards Chattanooga and Athens and Huntsville, or whether he might turn and follow Sherman for Georgia. He hadn't made up his mind yet, and the Federals certainly didn't know what he was going to do. So having a strong position at Pulaski was of strategic importance. And Major General David Stanley arrives with his corps really around the first week of November. And side note, I can't resist telling this. Whenever Stanley enters Pulaski, he says that the place is rife and rampant with corruption, that the federal officers there had been engaging in illicit trade in cotton. Starkweather, the one that I mentioned earlier, didn't have such a great reputation for sending gossip up the chain of command. He's implicated in that. And also, by this point, he's lost the confidence of his generals because they accuse him of being drunk and unfit for service. So Stanley walks into Pulaski and finds an utter mess. And he is obsessed with getting enough nails to work on the platform at the railroad depot at Pulaski to get enough supplies and ammunition in there to resist the Confederate advance should it come. Which really, I mean, that's rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic at this point, because Brigadier General Croxton is facing down the entirety of Hood's force. And as I say, no one really knows where Hood is going to go next. So Croxton and the Federal cavalry on Shoal Creek have a mammoth responsibility on their shoulders. That is, they have to alert headquarters if Hood moves and which direction that might be. And they're aware that if Hood strikes out towards Pulaski and they don't find out about it at first, then they may be cut off from their line of retreat. So they're not only holding the Confederates in check from advancing into Middle Tennessee, but they're trying to gain all information that they can. So it's a huge responsibility on Croxton's shoulders at that time. These are some beautiful images of Shoal Creek. This one is from about 1916, and then these are from the late 1870s, before the area was permanently changed by the inundation from Wilson Dam Reservoir. But Croxton is desperate for reinforcements, and they are going to come in the form of native of Maine cavalry division commander named Edward Hatch. Hatch had been ordered from Clifton, Tennessee, to join Sherman in his push towards the sea in Georgia. But whenever Hood crosses the Tennessee River at the Shoals, Hatch is halted at Pulaski and ordered down into Alabama to cooperate with Croxton along the line of Shoal Creek, to hold the Confederates at Florence, if at all possible, and to give the earliest indication of whatever move that they ultimately make. And it is at this time, in the first and second weeks of November 1864, that General Hatch visits the farm of my fourth great-grandmother, Bethany Gray. She's living in the community of Center Hill, which is really between Shoal Creek and Lexington. This is a drawing that I made, kind of showing what I imagine it would have looked like the cornfields then in the fall of 1864. And as Croxton and Hatch, in this terrible weather, are having to respond to this situation that nobody knows how it's going to shake down, they cannot rely on supplies to be hauled overland from Pulaski to feed their men and horses. It is simply impossible. With the state of the roads as they existed, and the fact that a wagon train could easily be overcome by Confederate cavalry, I mean, they really had no choice but to forage, which is the term that they use, forage, off of the local populations living in the area. And so they came to the home of my newly widowed fourth great-grandmother. I was telling the story to somebody, and she said, "I'm sorry, your fourth great-grandmother? What do you mean?" I mean that if you say the word great 4 times, like great-great-great-great-grandmother. Genealogists usually start counting after a certain number of greats because it gets very tedious as you go back. But she's my fourth great-grandmother. And this was enormously upsetting to her, obviously, because she had been a widow for less than a month at this point, had 10 kids to feed, and this is November. The harvest is coming in, and whatever they have is what they're going to have for the winter. And here is a cavalry commander encamping near her home, taking everything she has. This is from her petition, the Southern Plains petition she filed. I made complaint to General Hatch about taking all I had to live on. He said he could not help it. He was bound to have it, that I would get paid for it one day. And actually, as touching and as heart-wrenching as that was from Bethany Gray, my fourth great-grandmother, it was unfortunately a very common scene that would have played out at this time, and I know that through my research from the Southern Plains Commission. The 5 most commonly mentioned commanders from the claimants who say that they took their property are, number 1, General Hatch, number 2, General Wilson, which we'll see later on why that is. Number 3 is General Croxton. So the 3 most common commanders, 2 out of the 3 are here at Shoal Creek at this time. The most common dates that people say they had their property taken, number 1 is November 1864. Number 2 is January 1865. Number 3 is November 1863, Sherman crossed the Tennessee River in November 1863. Number 4 is December 1864. Number 5 is October 1864. So really what you have is a chunk between about October 1864 to January of 65, where in tandem to a situation where the valley is already pretty much depleted of supplies, the military necessity to forage off of local populations is greater than ever. And the testimony of the Southern Plains petitioners show that consistent pattern. And my fourth great-grandmother is far and away not the only one who's visited by Hatch at this time. And I'm submitting these documents to just kind of illustrate this. And I hope that this brings everything full circle for you, because I kind of started off talking about how I got started with the Civil War, and it's really this moment in time that fascinates me and what's my appetite for this. This is her deposition from her Southern Plains petition in 1873. All the items of the petition were taken by Union soldiers belonging to General Edward Hatch. They were then encamped in 3 miles of the claim at Taylor Springs. That was in November 1864. And then here, in the official records, is a report from General Hatch on the Lexington Road, November 20th, 1864. He says, I shall encamp tonight on Blue Water Creek on account of forage, about 30 miles from Lexington West. When he says on account of forage, he's talking about my great-grandmother's corn and bacon and cooking utensils. That's what he means. That's really as close as you get to a smoking gun in the official records. He was right there. He said 30 miles from Lexington. Now, Hood, as most of you know, this is one of the more popular elements of Civil War history in our region. Hood eventually does decide to invade Middle Tennessee. He presses out from Florence with all of his army. He had been waiting desperately for General Forrest to join him, and finally, after 3 weeks of a delay that they really couldn't afford to make, Forrest finally obliges him at the Shoals, and they press north by way of Lawrenceburg. And Hatch and Croxton sound the alarm up the Federal Officer Corps. And by this time, John N. Schofield is commanding federal forces at Pulaski, and he makes a mad dash to get back to Nashville before Hood can cut off his line. And repeatedly at Mount Pleasant and Columbia, Spring Hill, Schofield very narrowly escapes Hood's forces. They skirmish during the day, and whenever nightfall stops all action, Schofield withdraws to another point up the railroad. So Hood chases Schofield, basically, eager for a fight. The weather at this time is absolutely dismal. Snow, ice, many of the men are poorly clad, threadbare clothing, shoes with no soles if they have shoes at all. So it's a really deplorable condition of the men at this time in late November of 1864. Now, the coup de grace really of this movement happens, as most of us know, at the Battle of Franklin, November 30, 1864, where Hood, probably enraged that Schofield had continued to slip beyond his grasp, when arriving within sight of the town of Franklin on the afternoon of the 30th, orders his men to advance across open ground and take the entrenched federal position. Now, this is strategic suicide. He should have known better than anybody else because he was actually at Gettysburg. But for various reasons, Hood at this point is just rearing for a fight. And the slaughter at Franklin defies description. The only Confederate forces to make it to the federal line and a brief break through the federal line were all captured. Hood loses a number of his generals, and psychologically it's devastating to the Army of Tennessee and the Confederate columns. Sam Watkins, who is the memoir writer who is made famous in Ken Burns' Civil War documentary series, A Native of Columbia, Tennessee, he writes this following observation about how he felt at Franklin. Kind reader, back here my pen and courage and ability fail me. I shrink from butchery. Would to God that I could tear the page from these memoirs and from my own memory. It is the blackest page in the history of the War of the Lost Cause. It was the bloodiest battle of modern times in any war. It was the finishing stroke to the independence of the Southern Confederacy. Now this is Sam Watkins in hindsight, but psychologically it is devastating for the men of the Army of Tennessee. And although Hood continues to press forward towards Nashville, at that point it's pretty much a suicide mission. And whenever the Federal Army finally decides to come out of their fortification at Nashville over the frozen ground late in December 1864, the Confederates are pushed into an every man for himself route retreat, fleeing out of Middle Tennessee, virtually back over the same ground that they invaded a month earlier. Forrest and the Confederate cavalry do their very best to hold off the pursuing Federal cavalry enough to give the infantry a means of escape without being totally captured en masse. Some reports say that the Confederate infantry are just throwing their knapsacks and muskets to the side of the road, just getting any dead weight off of them so that they can escape faster. There's an engagement at Sugar Creek in Giles County where Forrest finally makes a stand, trying to give the Confederates more time to make it back south of the Tennessee River. Hood crosses his beleaguered force at Bainbridge Ferry. This is an image of Bainbridge from the 1870s. And is very narrowly missed by a gunboat, the Neosho, which is trying to intercept Hood in his retreat. Now, when General Hood makes it south of the Tennessee River, the Federal Army pretty much says, "I'll let him go. He's out of our hair now." But the result of this is that a huge force of cavalry had pursued Hood back into Lauderdale County, Alabama, to the water's edge of the Tennessee at the Shoals. And although they say, "We'll let Hood go," they decide to halt and regroup and start planning for their next move in the spring. And the result of this is General Wilson's massive encampment at Gravelly Springs. Now, Gravelly Springs, because of its significance, substantially far away from the city of Florence, as to prevent depredation on the part of the soldiers. But then also sitting above Culver Shoals wouldn't be affected by fluctuations in the water level if the water should drop, so that they could continue to receive transports by way of the Tennessee to stockpile supplies, goods, horses. And for 3 months, Wilson encamps at Gravelly Springs, preparing for their spring campaign. J.P. Cannon, who we met back in 1861, who joined the 27th Alabama, he retreats with Hood's army out of Middle Tennessee. And when they enter Lauderdale County, he says to a superior officer, I'm coming close to my house now. Would you mind if I just take a leave and go? And of course, he's one less mouth to feed, one less person close, and say he can go. And he returns back home to Gravelly Springs, just in time to witness Wilson's encampment. And J.P. Cannon says, the hills, which a few weeks before had been covered with forest trees, were now bare. Every vestige of timber had been removed, even the leaves swept off, and the hills and valleys were dotted with white tents as far as the eye could reach. Wilson's encampment at this time takes absolutely everything that they can get their hands on. I mean, they took apart people's barns, they took apart fence rails, using them to build barracks for themselves, to burn for firewood, took every horse and mule in the vicinity, all the corn and pork that they could get. The people living in and around Waterloo and Gravelly Springs really subsidized Wilson's movement. But this has sort of the ironic positive effect for the city of Florence and the people of the Shoals. Wilson's encampment becomes really a nexus for trying to get a clamp on lawlessness and depredations that are taking place in North Alabama and restoring some semblance of civil authority to the area. First, under the leadership of the military authorities, or trying to get a clamp on this lawlessness that's happening within the federal ranks. And from Gravelly Springs on March 6th, Lot Abraham, this guy here, is sent out on an expedition in the direction of Florence to try and hunt down a gang of robbers who are in and out of federal uniform and bring them to justice. His report is really interesting, but it's quite lengthy, and I'm not going to be able to read it all. But he says essentially that they heard a party calling themselves federal soldiers had passed through Florence that day, robbing and plundering. And he says that they're all a part of this man's command, Lieutenant Elias Thrasher of the 2nd Tennessee Mounted Infantry, USA. Now, he says critically that the citizens all say that Thrasher is an honorable man, but blame him for having such men with him, among whom are Tom and Bishop Clark, Tom Dennis, Paul Kitty, Bill Bridges, and Peter Grimes are the name of some of his party. Most of you will be familiar with the names Tom and Bishop Clark, who are notorious outlaws who, according to legend, one of them is buried under Tennessee Street. Not true, but it's a good story. These are some instances in the newspaper that are not published in Shoals. These are from places like Kansas, the New York Times, talking about instances of lawlessness in and around Florence at that time. One of them, the murder of John Wilson at his plantation near St. Florine in May 1865, which was being made from 1865. This headline is Southern barbarism. A great many murders have been committed in the vicinity of Florence, Alabama, in the past few months. And then these men give accounts of atrocious deeds of cruelty and murder that have been perpetrated in the village and the vicinity within a few days. So these instances were notorious and certainly would have terrorized the local people who were trying to live through this, even after they've made it through the darkest days of the war. I really want to read this account because it's more close to home for me. One of these final sprees of violence in April 1865, this was a report submitted to the headquarters back in Nashville for some of these happenings. On Sunday, the 9th of April, 3 soldiers, Brewer, Stutz, and Kitty by name, the 2 Confederates who did not show themselves and therefore cannot be identified, belonging to a company of the 2nd Tennessee Mounted Infantry, which is stationed at Clifton, came to the house of Mr. William Johnson, living on Sugar Creek, some 18 or 20 miles southwest of Pulaski, and demanded of his wife, he not being home, $12,000. She told them that she had no money, and when they hung her and her daughter several times, completing their diabolical work by each of them outraging the person of Mrs. Johnson. From Johnson's house, these men went to the house of Dr. John Wade, Johnson's brother-in-law living in the same neighborhood, and by the same process of hanging and threats, extracted $50 from them. I won't go on with this, but they plundered their way from Pulaski to Wayland Springs, basically repeating the same modus operandi with every house that they came to, saying, "Where's your money?" If you didn't give it to them, they will pull you up on a rope until within an inch of your life, let you drop down and ask you the question again, and perhaps see if you remember this time where your money was. One of the men in the company was Walter Stutz, who we met last time, who will be my 4th great-grandfather's son-in-law after the war. He's my 3rd great-grandmother's second husband. Now, this is obviously extremely alarming to local people, and the federal army in and around Pulaski is charged with going down to Florence and getting a clamp on this lawlessness. And the official orders that come down to Brigadier General R.W. Johnson from his superior, Whipple, he says, instruct the party going to Florence to remain a reasonable length of time for the people to organize their forts. If they do not move in a matter of a few days, the force can return. So the purpose of the army going down to Florence is not only to get a clamp on the lawlessness, but to allow the people to start to organize their court system to function again. Because by this time, the Lauderdale County Court was a persona non grata. It really didn't exist. It was not functioning. It had not for a year. And so as the war is winding down and Lee surrenders at Appomattox, and Johnston surrenders in North Carolina to Sherman, and men start to take the oath of amnesty, reestablishing civil government is a top priority for the federal army. And apparently the soldiers of Johnson are very well received by the people of Florence. The people of Florence sent a petition asking that the forces stay longer, because they still needed them in the assistance of getting a clamp on law and order and reestablishing the authority of the courts. And if I might opine philosophically here about why so much lawlessness and depredation took place at the end of the war, I think a lot of these guys who had been enriching themselves off of the chaos of the situation for the past couple of years began to see the direction the wind was blowing and knew that the war was coming to an end and that the jig was about to be up. And so if they wanted to, one last hurrah or plunder, then this was their chance to do it. But the spring of 1865 is one of the most ghastly periods whenever it comes to interpersonal violence here in Shoals. These are two scans from the Lauderdale County Probate Minutes, Volume C, which span the years 1860 to 1869. They are 2 consecutive pages. The last entry on page 322 is from September 1864. This is right about the time of Forrest's reign. On the very next page, it's from August 1865. So for basically an entire year, from 1864, September 1864 to August of 65, the Lauderdale County Court does not function, does not exist. There's military agency for this. This first entry from 65 is actually a bond of several prominent citizens pledging themselves for the sum of $10,000 to invest a new county clerk under the authority of the provisional governor of the state of Alabama. So with August 1865, we start to see, through the help of the federal army getting a clamp on lawlessness, the ability of the civic institutions and the local civilian authorities to begin to function again after the war had ended all of that process. And now as I kind of conclude here for you all, just kind of to round this back out and bring it back home, so to speak, for what this all means for me. Because I think the temptation in going through a lot of detailed history, it's so abstract, it's names and dates on paper, and you forget really that these are real people in real places. But for me, as I say, this is all enormously significant for me, personal for me, because this is the site where Bethany Gray and her farm was located, and I know that from county probate records. This is very close to where I live. Actually, I played in the little creek here, Possum Creek, which is at the foot of the cemetery where she and her family are buried. It's an idyllic place, it's a beautiful place, it's my home. And to sort of be able to look back in time with a time machine of history and historical research and be able to tell you what happened to her here in Lauderdale County, on this place, this beautiful place. I think that's part of the charm and the mystique of my work and what gives me purpose in talking to you all, is that, we all have a story, and this is my family's story, and the sacrifice that she went through, subsidizing the restoration of civil government for the Stars and Stripes here in North Alabama. Her family literally on the front lines of it at a critical moment. It's something that gives me a lot of purpose. And it's a tremendous pleasure to be able to tell you all about that experience. And as I started to put this all into context, why did the federal cavalry encamp at Tacoma in the first place? Well, you see, it's really a story that's 300 years in the making. From Jamestown on up to the election of 1860 and Hood's Middle Tennessee campaign. Now, I will leave you with this. So much of my work in putting the shoals in context in a larger scheme has to do with, as I mentioned, the Southern Claims Commission. This is a map that I created that shows by county the number of approved claimants to the Southern Claims Commission throughout the Confederacy. Purple is quite a lot, and red is quite a lot, and green means they have at least one claimant. But you'll see from this, I hope, that North Alabama and East Tennessee, especially North Alabama, really stand out. There are more claimants here really than anywhere else in the entire Mississippi Valley, with few exceptions. It's really comparable to Northern Virginia in terms of approved claimants. Now what this shows us is the intersection between Union citizens and the necessity of the federal army to forage off of local populations. And I hope that you see then how unique North Alabama is in the context of the entire Confederacy, of what a role it played in the war here in the Tennessee Valley. Lauderdale County actually has the third most number of approved claimants in the state, after Walker County and Cherokee County. Now, putting that further into context, very briefly, Walker County, the most number of claimants in the state of Alabama, virtually 100% of those claimants come from one man at one moment in time. That's General Wilson in the spring of 1865. as he made his way south towards Selma. And in Cherokee County, the second most, also, virtually all of those claims come from one man and one woman at a time. That's General Sherman in '64, as he pursues Hood and decides to let him run to Tennessee. But Lauderdale County is extraordinarily diverse in terms of the commanders who take property, in terms of the periods of time at which that property is taken. And so that shows us what a crisscrossed revolving door Lauderdale County and the Shoals was during the war. And in the absence of any large battle here, like at Gettysburg or Shiloh, really what you see is a much more intimate, interpersonal, neighbor between neighbor, community between community type of literal civil war. And the movements of large armies, tens of thousands of men, who are all on the way to somewhere else, but moving through the Shoals and taking the Shoals apart, burning it, eating it on their way. And in that sense, we are strategically indispensable in the course of the war in the West. Not to mention the fact that Grant, the man who's going to win it all for the Union at Appomattox, cuts his teeth on the war at Shiloh and rises through the ranks on the Tennessee River, as does his good friend Sherman, who's going to take total war to Georgia and win it on the South.